welcome to ACC. Today our topic is composition scheme. What is meant by composition scheme? Under GST there are n number of rates like 5%, 12%, 18% and 28%. But for small taxpayers, government brought a new tax scheme that is called composition scheme. What is meant by composition scheme, sir? For small taxpayers, there is a lot of burden to file the return under GST and to carry forward the input tax credit and to pay the taxes under normal scheme. So to avoid number of compliances, government brought composition scheme for small taxpayers. What is meant by composition scheme, sir? For small taxpayers, it will reduce the compliance issues and the tax liability on them to pay tax to the government. There are two schemes in composition scheme. One is 10.1 and 10.2 and second one is 10.2a. What is meant by 10.1 and 10.2, sir? And what is meant by 10.2a, sir? What is meant by 10.1 and 10.2 is the composition scheme will apply to the supplier of goods and restaurant services, but in case of 10.2a, it will be applicable for only service providers. For 10.1 and 10.2, who can opt for composition scheme, sir? If a supplier whose aggregate turnover does not exceed 1.5 crores in normal states and 75 lakhs in special category states, then he can opt for composition scheme under section 10.1 and 10.2. But who are special category states, sir? Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Mizoram, Tripura, Nagaland and Meghalaya and Sikkim, Uttarakhand are special category states. What is meant by special category states, sir? Nothing but the central government gave some tax reliefs under Income Tax Act and some tax incentives to them. Then that states are called special category states. Sir, what is meant by 10.2a composition scheme, sir? The composition scheme, who can opt the 10.2a, sir? Who can opt for 10.2a means the person who is ineligible, under section 10.1 and 10.2, then that person can opt composition scheme under 10.2a. What is difference between 10.1 and 10.2 and 10.2a, sir? The difference is simple. Here in 10.1 and 10.2, only supplier of goods and only restaurant services can opt for composition scheme under section 10.1 and 10.2. But in case of 10.2a, any other service provider can opt for composition scheme under 10.2a. But what is difference, sir? Here the aggregate turnover, the threshold limit, applicable threshold limit is the difference. Nothing is much difference. What is meant by threshold limit, sir? The aggregate turnover, a person whose aggregate turnover does not exceed 1.5 crores or 75 lakhs will be applicable to the 10.1 and 10.2a. But in case of 10.2a, it will be limited to 50 lakhs. What is meant by aggregate turnover, sir? Aggregate turnover includes taxable supplies, exempt supplies, interstate and export supplies and taxes other than GST, but does not include RCM taxes and any tax under GST and interest or discount on loans and advances. Sir, what is meant by why interstate supplies are considered, sir? In case of composition scheme, interstate supplies are considered for calculation, but a person supplying goods or services under interstate supplies, he cannot opt for composition scheme. Then why you are calculating export and interstate supplies for calculating aggregate turnover, sir? Because for aggregate turnover, it will be calculated on PAN. It will be calculated based on PAN number on all India basis. So it will include both export turnover and interstate turnover. Sir, what is difference, sir, between composition scheme and normal scheme? What is the difference, sir? The rate will be paid at lower rates. The tax will be paid at lower rates. In case of composition scheme, the rates are maximum 6%. But in case of normal scheme, the maximum rates are 28% and 40% as the case may be. Sir, who are eligible, sir? What are the rates, sir? For manufacturer, it is 1% on turnover based on state or union territory. here note point is turnover, not taxable supplies. That means here turnover includes both taxable and exempt supplies. That is under composition scheme. If manufacturer is supplying goods or services, then he has to pay 1% tax on both exempt supplies and taxable supplies. But in case of trader, it is not applicable, because in case of trader only 1% on taxable supplies. It is not on entire turnover. What is difference, sir? Difference is on in case of manufacturer, the tax will be paid both exempted goods and taxable goods, but trader, in case of trader, it will be applicable only taxable supplies. It will not we will not pay any tax on exempted goods. But in case of restaurant service providers, that is here 5% on turnover, that is 5% on turnover in state or union territory, that is 2.5% CGST and 2.5% SGST. But service provider under section 10(2)(a), that is 6% on turnover in state or union territory, that is nothing but 3% CGST and 3% SGST. In composition tax, the tax will be payable on taxable as well as exempt supplies. But in case of trader, the tax will be payable only on taxable supplies, but it will not include exempt supplies. Sir, who can opt, sir? Every person can opt? No, only composition person, only a person who is not eligible for composition schemes are the following persons. 1. The person making interstate supplies, that is between interstate supplies means the person supplying goods between two different states or different state and union territory, then that supply is called interstate supply. So person making interstate supplies is not eligible for composition scheme. And the person who is making non-taxable supplies is also not eligible for composition scheme. What is meant by non-taxable supplies, sir? Non-taxable supplies, on that GST is not payable, so there is no need to apply composition scheme. Sir, next, supply of service through e-commerce operator. What is meant by supply of service through e-commerce operator, sir? Nothing but urban clamp services or Ola services. Okay, sir. Ola services. Then casual taxable person or non-resident taxable person is also ineligible for composition scheme. And supplier of notified goods. What is meant by notified goods, sir? Some goods are notified by the department. For if in case any supplier is supplying those notified goods, then he cannot claim composition scheme. What are notified goods, sir? Nothing but fly ash bricks, bricks of fossil meals, earthen or roofing materials, edible ice, pan masala, tobacco and tobacco products, aerated water. What is meant by aerated water, sir? Aerated water is nothing but soft drinks. Sir, who are ineligible? Who are ineligible for composition scheme under section 10(1) and 10(2)? Sir, for only 10(1) and 10(2), there is minimal limit of service provider, but in case of entire service, entirely 10(2)(a) is entirely applicable to the service provider, but in case of 10(1) and 10(2), it is only applicable to the restaurant service providers. But department gave some limit to service for supplier of goods. Even though he is supplying goods, he can supply services up to the restricted limit. What is that restriction limit, sir? 10% of turnover in state or union territory in the preceding financial year, or 5 lakhs, whichever is higher. In case of 10(1) and 10(2) only, this limit is applicable, because in 10(2)(a), as it is already stated, it is applicable entirely for service provider. There is no limit up to 50 lakhs. If the person is not crossing the turnover of 50 lakhs, he can claim composition scheme. Sir, what can a composition taxable person claim? Can a composition taxable person collect tax from recipient? No, because composition person is itself paying lower tax. So composition person should not collect tax from the recipient, and he is not eligible to issue tax invoice, because only registered under normal scheme person can only issue tax invoice. So instead of tax invoice, he can supply bill of supply, and composition person shall mention on a bill and in place of business that he is a composition person, and composition person cannot claim ITC on his input goods and services, and composition person can pay tax under RCM if he is liable to pay tax under RCM transactions. And all registered person, if a person is having multiple business against a single PAN, then turnover will be calculated on all India basis, not on a specific business basis. If any business is eligible for composition scheme, all will be eligible for composition scheme, otherwise all will be out of the composition scheme. If any person is having more than one place covering in more than one state or union territory, then if any of those states is having a special category states, then the threshold limit for composition scheme will be applicable for lower limits, which means if any person is having a business in special category states, then instead of 1.5 crore threshold limit, it will be 75 lakhs threshold limit. So lower limit will be applicable. Opting for composition scheme. When to opt for composition scheme, sir? Only registered person can opt for composition scheme, or newly registered person can also opt for composition scheme, or existing persons also can opt for composition scheme. If the person is already applied for registration, already registered person, he can file form CMP02, then he can convert from regular registration to composition scheme. But if a person applying for entirely for new registration, then he can apply in part B, that is registration form part B. In that he can apply form REG01 for composition scheme. And next, who can withdraw, sir? When can withdraw? If the conditions are not satisfied, then he can withdraw from the composition scheme, or in case of crossing that threshold limit of 1.5 crores or 75 lakhs as the case may be, then he can opt for normal scheme instead of composition scheme. For that he is liable to file any forms, sir. Yes, sir. To failure to compel any condition, then within 7 days from failure of satisfying the condition, he can file the form and opt out of the composition scheme. If he wants to opt composition scheme voluntarily, opt out the composition scheme voluntarily, then he can file for such withdrawal. Okay, sir. Thank you.